You're all worried about kings and democracy. At the same time, you want to compromise our vote and not have voter ID. How do those two ideas live inside the same head?
I'd love to see the budget of the DNR and what they're spending my money on. I would love to see the waste. If ever there was a DOGE target, if ever there was a target to scrutinize the waste and fraud.
Zach Abraham, how are you?
I am doing well. How are you?
Okay. I'm doing pretty good. You made a prediction on the show last week that came true, so we'll talk about it at the end. I thought it was very funny. As soon as it happened, I'm like, Zach said that was going to happen. All right, so we were discussing, and we have been discussing about, okay, like maybe we shouldn't get caught up so much on how much money are we saving, what's the dollars that are being cut or whatever. And maybe we should talk more about the efficiency improvements that DOGE is making. And in the long run, I think those will ultimately save the government money, and they'll help catch people who are voting illegally, apparently. So I hadn't heard about this, but so I knew there was something called the SAVE system. So it stands for the Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements database. Federal database will help you figure out if somebody's in the country illegally before they're given an entitlement. But there were a lot of problems with it. It wasn't being used to the extent that it could be used. So under Kristi Noem, she works with DOGE, and they improved the SAVE system. So they did a couple things to it. They got rid of, overhauled by eliminating fees to use the database for searches. So before, like a state that wanted to use it had to pay a fee. So you don't have to pay a fee anymore. Streamlines mass status checks, and they integrated criminal records, immigration timelines, and addresses in there. But I think making it free is one of the big ones. So immediately after these changes were made to SAVE, the state of Texas starts using it a little bit differently. And they now say that the improvements to SAVE have helped them identify, for now, 33 non-citizens who illegally voted in Texas in the 2024 election. I'm going to guess that's probably low.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I was going to say is since they took the fee off it and it's more accessible, I bet you Newsom's already got an entire team digging through there. They want to root out illegal
For
voting.
sure. Yes.
Yeah. He's all over that right now. Matter of fact, he'd probably come on here for an interview with you, but he's too caught up, right? They're trying to learn how to use the SAVE database. I mean, I'll guarantee you that the total number of fraudulent voting is way higher than that.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not one of those people that thinks that the fraudulent voting is I think it could be statistically significant, but what I mean is I don't think it's making up 8% of the vote or something like that. But when you have elections being decided by 0.5%, and you have so much energy and money and time dedicated to keeping elections unsecured, of course that the grift has gone up in that side of things, and of course the number of illegal people voting, and by illegal votes, that could embody people that are here illegally, but also like think about. You know how many votes get cast every year because somebody passes away and their ballot shows up at the house and somebody fills it out and sends it back in all the time?
I am sure it happens.
Oh, it does. And here's the thing. I bet you it happens on both sides, right? For now, do I think it happens more on the left? Yes, for a variety of different reasons. For instance, they're the party that's pushing back against, voter ID, which is preposterous. But yeah, the biggest problem I think that you've got is what you're seeing with the states right now, like the state of California, meaning there's so many of these things that we can do to improve. And again, I just look at the people that are dismissing these savings because they're not big enough. Well, so here's usually how you do it. You usually compile a bunch of small savings and it adds up into larger. That's just kind of how it's worked in my life at times, So, I think it's a great step that they're taking, but I still don't think it addresses. We've got a serious issue. Everybody has thrown around the term constitutional crisis. It's kind of like racism, right? It's been said so many times. It's meaningless, but I think that you're looking at a somewhat of a constitutional crisis right now with state governments in direct violation of federal law, standing up and saying, we will not adhere. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we're going to instruct our employees to obstruct justice.
Yeah.
I think that has to get addressed in some way, shape, or form. Or you've got this SAVE program, which every state should be mandated to use in some way, right? Especially now that it doesn't have a fee. They're not going to use it. They don't want to know what that number. They don't want to know. They don't want to know that data. So, I think you can. I think a lot of these things are going to be helpful, especially on the periphery, but they're not going to be mainstream helpful until you address that.
Yeah. And you make the perfect point. This is a great tool if you choose to use it. And you've got Texas. So the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, he put out this statement. He said, the referral from Secretary Nelson comes after Texas gained access to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services SAVE database. Texas was able to access the database following President Trump's signing of an executive order directing the Department of Homeland Security to offer the database at no cost to all states in order to preserve the integrity of our election. So all states, but if Texas right away already found 33 non-citizen voters, and Texas inarguably has better election integrity and cares more about election integrity and stopping non-citizens from voting, imagine how many Washington State or Oregon or California have. If you have Democrats actively trying not to know if non-citizens are voting, if Texas is finding them with this database, just imagine how many we would find.
Yeah, well, and not only that, but I mean, all the reports and stories, and I'm not, not like out there reports, but like stuff that we've seen proof of that we know that was going on. Look at the drive. Look how the drive to get people registered to vote that they knew weren't citizens.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And which still just baffles. I've never understood the. I mean, I understand it, but even like as a kid, one of the reasons that I never cheated I cheated on a math test in my junior year of high school. Yeah, that was that.
Still,
but in terms of like. Oh yeah, it does. It does. Well, because cheating and integrity is a big deal in our house. Like I tell my kids, I'm like, look, I made a lot of stupid mistakes growing up, so I'm going to be very patient with you. But when it comes to dishonesty and character and integrity, that's when the hammer's going to drop. Yeah. Right. Because to me, those are big issues. But but little things like still to this day, like why don't I cheat in golf? Because I'm not going to admit that I have to cheat to beat you.
Yeah.
Right. Like. The other thing is intellectually, I can't stand, it would be impossible for me to back a cause that I thought required cheating or violating the rules in order for it to be successful. You know what I mean? So, but clearly those people do not have those same constraints. Clearly they don't have those same hangups. So it's a problem that is much larger than is being reported. And why do you know that? It's sort of like in government, right? It is in government, but it's just like that we've talked about with the budget. If you do not have oversight into something and there is no oversight process, I don't need to look to know if there are untoward things going on.
Yeah.
Of course there are, right? Why? Because you're not looking. It's that simple.
Yeah, and so there's a couple things I want to talk about, immigration and the voting front, but no party is going to change something with the voting process if it won't benefit them. I think that's just, you're not going to push back against something really hard if there's not a motivation for it. So no party is going to do something that makes it harder for them to win elections, like period. So that's why, Democrats know that requiring voter ID will make it harder for them to win elections. They just know that. So you have to wonder, okay, well, why is that? Is it illegals? Is it you truly, because they want to make you think, well, no, it's some Americans, hardworking people, they just have a hard time going to get the ID, or maybe they lost it. It's like, okay, give me a break. But also, with Republicans in some of the southern states where you have to wait in line for 8 hours to cast a ballot, that's ridiculous. It is something that I think inhibits or hurts the ability to actually exercise your right to vote. So, the only reason Democrats wouldn't want voter ID is they know it would ultimately hurt them at the ballot box.
Well, it's funny. I was listening to a video this weekend where this topic came up, and there was somebody that was defending critical race theory, and this subject came up about voter IDs, and they were sitting there making the argument that these people don't have the same access. And the argument they said was, and I thought this was really clever, it's not about the vote, it's about the safety of the people voting at those locations, because they're afraid that if we have voter IDs, then they'll be able to track where those people are going to vote. Therefore, they can target hide black voting areas and go to discriminate them. And I just went down that and I went, man, if you believe that,
yeah,
I have a bridge to sell you, because I mean, look how far down the rabbit hole we're going to back this up. The other thing is I'd sit there and go, hey guys, so what you're saying is we're going to compromise the democratic process because you're afraid that people at a certain polling location, you have no evidence.
No,
but you're
they don't
afraid that
believe
people
that.
no, and they're going to be obstructed or persecuted. So we're going to knowingly compromise our entire voting system. So somebody, I mean, it just doesn't even make money.
No.
It doesn't make any sense on the face of it, right? You got to tip your cap to them though, because they probably workshopped that for like 5 weeks, trying to figure out like how do we justify backing up no voter IDs, right? But yeah, I mean, that's the issue. To me, that is one of the biggest obstacles we face, is that is not considered a guaranteed loser of a topic when you're looking at elections, right? Like the fact that you have relatively 50% of the country that will go along with that, that to me is just the insane part, where you're like, okay, guys, we're advocating, you got to have an ID to go into an R-rated movie. You got to buy a pack of cigarettes, but not to vote. Like what?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. There's no justification for it. And I do think even if the SAVE system and the changes to that don't, sway elections, I mean, but to your point, there's been elections in the state decided by a few dozen votes. So, even the smallest number of people who are voting fraudulently can make a difference, especially if they're all voting for the people of the same political party. But when we get into this a few years down the road and all these deportations have happened and, the Trump administration kind of tightened things up a little bit, I actually wonder how profound of an impact it will have. So if you got a couple million people who are deported, but also, one of the reasons I think Democrats are pushing back so hard against the deportations is they're concerned about the census, and they're concerned about what it'll mean for states like California, for their allotment of seats to Congress. So then you start to have real impacts. And I do think once Trump is done, there will be some electoral consequences for Democrats with the people who have been sent out of the country.
Yeah, well, and look, if there are consequences for them on the election side of things, then my answer is good.
Yes.
Right? Because what that tells you is that, yes, there were a substantial amount of illegal votes being cast, right? If on the flip side, if it isn't as impactful to them, then good. That means that they were left. See, this is the issue. And this is the problem I have with so many of these issues. And DOGE to me is a great example of this. These are non-political issues.
Yeah.
These are things that sober-minded adults could sit there and go, hey, guys, you're all worried about kings and democracy. At the same time, you want to compromise our vote and not have voter ID. How do those two ideas live inside the same head? Right? It's madness. And they're like, well, what's the correlation? What's the correlation between free elections and not being governed by an authoritarian, autocrat? Like, what, are you serious? Like, that's right. The sanctity of your vote is what preserves kings from taking over, not a stupid protest.
Yeah.
Right. So, it's just, and that's where we're at. That's what makes these discussions so hard, is because you've got a statistically significant chunk of the voting base, the voting bloc, that is voting on completely non-factual, fear-based nonsense. And when you try to have a debate with them, right, it's all superlatives and just idiocy. And that's what's protecting that ignorance. You know what I mean? Like, and so, it's so frustrating.
Yeah. And I know there's a ballot measure, an effort to get something on the ballot for Washington state voters to decide on whether they want voter ID. And Democrats are going to throw out all the stops they already are to try to keep it off the ballot, because I think they know the answer. I think they know that's actually a pretty popular policy if you take the fear mongering out of the equation. So if a state like Washington allows voters to decide on it, well, I think we'll find out pretty quick whether it's really a racist, horrible, awful policy or not.
Yeah, but I mean, even there in the state of Washington, I'd sit there and look at these people, and this shocked me as well. But I'd sit there and go, "You're worried about people making." I won't put the stupidity of the average voter. I will never underestimate the stupidity of the average voter in this state. That's the issue. You've got a You've got a glazed over, extraordinarily uninformed / misinformed voter, and they're making really stupid decisions without knowing what they're actually voting for.
Yeah, and then complaining about things in the back end, like, oh, how'd this happen? Gee, that's
you voted
weird.
for it.
Yeah, you voted for that. You know, the gas prices, you voted for that, all that. It's just ridiculous. All right, so DOGE doing a lot of good stuff. I think that's a great thing, exposing illegal voters. Some of the stuff they're doing, not so popular, even with Republicans. Let's talk about it in our DOGE Miss of the Week. All right, turns out the big, beautiful bill has a big bad part to it that came out, and people are livid over it, and really the right is starting to sort of give up on it as well. This from KXLY. Big beautiful bill could put millions of acres of Washington and Idaho public land up for sale. So not only in Washington and Idaho, obviously we live over here, so we're concerned with that, but it would sell like millions of acres of public land in some of the most beautiful and pristine areas of the country into private hands. I get it that we want money and to fix our deficit. That, to me, feels like it should be a last resort.
Well, it should be a last resort and one that's never taken advantage of, because once again, and this is the problem, right? So then you hear a bunch of Republicans thinking that somehow this is fiscal, fiscal restraint. Guys, you have a spending problem. It does, like, quit. So now we're effectively going to be the heroin addict that's pawning mom's coffee maker, right? And sofa so we can get another hit, right? Because that's what you're doing, right? Like that. If you're not addressing the spending side of this equation, nothing other than that matters. And you're just rearranging chairs on the decks on the Titanic, right? Not only that, but like I mentioned to you, one of my other concerns is who buys that land, right? Well, it's not going to be you and me,
China,
right? China, Bill Gates, more and more, will some of those people buy it and probably preserve it? Sure. But I've never really looked into it. And on the face of it, when I heard about that, I just dismissed it immediately as nonsense. Not because, look, is it possible that you've gotten too much land squared away? I wouldn't think so. And my feeling is even if I went through it rigorously, I wouldn't come away thinking that. But it's possible. Yeah. My whole point is just it's for what? Well, it's going to help us close. But you just increased the deficit by $500 billion this year. Okay, that is a much bigger problem than some land we need to sell to fill in a stopgap, right? And so say we sell this big chunk of land. Let's say we raise $1 trillion. Okay, that $1 trillion makes up over the next 2 years for this year's spending increase.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't balance the budget, not even for 1 year. It makes up for the increase in spending announced this year for 2 years. And then you're still down the $1 trillion in land, and you're still staring at a deficit that's running at 6.5% to 8% of the GDP. It's just stupid.
Yeah, and to make this, so I'll make the sort of devil's advocate argument, and this was a Republicans' idea, but I think that this has been an argument from more liberty-minded people, so I would say more kind of libertarian, anti-government factions, that the government owns too much land, right? And to a certain extent, I agree with that. I mean, in Washington State, one of the things we're seeing that's driving ranchers nuts is the state will come in. Mike and I own some property. It just happened around us. And the state will buy up thousands of acres of land. It'll never be in private hands again. The ranchers might not be able to use it to graze their cattle. And so it's just sort of like, why are you buying that? Why do you need it? But with these federal lands that they're talking about here, these are areas that people have now for years and years and years enjoyed, like for outdoor recreation, hiking, fishing, all of these things. So I think, the feds already have it. We have a conversation about scooping up more land, and do you really need to do that? But again, I don't know, to your point, that this ought to be the priority. And if we've already kept these areas very pristine, we're used to it being public land that the public can enjoy, I think we've just got to keep it that way.
Yeah, and to me, a state, again, I think completely different rules should apply to states than the feds.
Yeah.
For a whole host of reasons, because I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think that is nonsense.
Yeah.
Right, going in there and buying up pieces of land, in between things where, previous neighbors had agreed that we'll allow an easement here, an easement there, and these things have been going on for generations. Then all of a sudden they come by the land in the middle and, oh, we're not causing you any problems. You're like, well, yeah, you are, because we've been doing this for 100 years, That's a much different scenario to me. I think there should be constraints on that. But honestly, I'll sit back and allow a state to deal with that, right? Like, meaning you guys can have votes on it. You can have, honestly, I would think, looking at our budget situation, that the Washington state government won't be looking to buy any land too soon. Of course, the way they allocate capital, you can't rule anything out. But yeah, on the federal side of it, and like I said, I'm not saying that I am totally opposed to the idea of selling some land, selling some assets. I'm not opposed to the idea that perhaps we even have too much. I'm a big outdoors guy. I love, Teddy Roosevelt's one of my political heroes. So, throwing the antitrust laws around and establishing, federal parks, national parks. So probably not hard to figure out where I fall on the side of this. But my whole point is that is not about fiscal restraint.
No.
Okay. Yeah. That is liquidating an invaluable asset to deal with a spending problem. And that sounds more like how you keep a drug addiction going, as opposed to dealing with a spending problem.
Yeah.
Right. Here's the other thing that we have to think about. Oh, great. So do you trust government to take the proceeds from those land sales and use them to pay down debt? I don't.
Or use them for anything productive at all.
Yeah. Or maybe they'll donate more money to USAID and donate to more institutions that are actively undermining or looking to undermine our judicial system. Right. So the other side of it is, one of the other reasons why I'm not for the sale of land is because that puts more money in the hands of the most fiscally inept people on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, great. We've got a drunk over there that keeps shooting his gun off in his backyard. We're going to go deliver him a crate of ammo. That'll fix it.
Yeah.
Like, come on. Anyway.
At the same time, so that one, I think there's reasons you can't justify it. How do you justify it? Now, there are some things they want to sell that are justifiable. You've got all these empty freaking office buildings, right? And we're paying up the wazoo for office space and federally owned buildings that are mostly sitting empty. So DOGE is now moving to sell off almost $500 million in federal real estate and relocate cabinet agency headquarters. So this is, when I say DOGE, it's the DOGE caucus in Congress. And so they're looking for ways to, cut costs, but also that would raise quite a bit of revenue. This seems non-controversial to me. We don't need to pay for empty buildings.
No. And yeah, the other thing is, that to me makes a whole lot of sense, right? The government doesn't just be sitting there holding on to ownership of land that isn't being used.
Yeah.
Right. Especially in an inflationary environment, right? Meaning, look in a scenario, or look in any one of these cities. I got to believe that DC is the one where you're going to find the majority of it. But let's go look in some of these cities and go look at the cost of living. Let's go look at the cost of rent. Let's go look at the cost of land. Okay. Well, if you got the U.S. government, and usually it's sitting on some pretty prime acreage, right? If the U.S. government's sitting there with their old buildings, that is by definition keeping the cost of housing and the cost of rents and all that stuff artificially higher.
Yeah.
Right? Because it is not currently being utilized, but it's taken up the space. So no, I think that stuff, that is a perfectly logical argument to make. And that to me is a completely separate issue from federally protected lands and parks.
Yeah, I was just looking at some of the pictures of the buildings that they're proposing for sale. The James W. Forrestal Federal Building, called the Little Pentagon, the Hubert H. Humphrey Jr. Building. They're hideous. They're genuinely hideous. They're like those epitome of like a federal, and look,
do they have like that rock?
Utilitarian.
Rock?
More like concrete. It's just like a concrete box. Which, look, I'm glad. I don't think we need to return to the days where all our government buildings are made of marble and gilded gold. But they're just hideous. So I hope somebody buys it, knocks it down, builds Trump Hotel there or something. Make it something nice and usable.
I was talking about, in my mind, the minute you said they're hideous. Remember how like some of those old buildings made back in the 60s and 70s, the siding was like pebbles?
Yes.
Like little rocks and stuff like that on the side of it. They just look hideous.
Yeah. The Grand Coulee Dam, like the visitor center area and all of that, it's very, I don't know what the idea was, but it seems very like spaceshipy, when it's like, it's just interesting. The things that you thought would never go out of style or never look weird, like any homes, anything built in the 70s, essentially, Just like, wow, you guys just really went for it, right? So
that was rough.
Yeah. So let's get rid of the federal buildings. Keep the federal land.
Yes. Yeah. And 80s weren't much of a step up, but as far as some of those color schemes go.
Oh.
But yeah, no. Oh yeah. Remember the 80s? I mean, sometimes
yellow, brown.
Oh, yeah. It looked like artwork had been murdered or something, and inside some of those places, it was bad. And the carpet, the shag rust colored carpet back in there's some bad stuff.
It's rough. My grandma had carpet in her kitchen. Carpet in her kitchen, like thick carpet.
What?
It's like, what? It's gross. Like, you need a hazmat crew in there at that point.
Oh, that's bad.
All right,
Yuck.
let's get to. Go ahead.
Yeah, go. Yeah.
Let's get to some Doge adjacent news. You should be eager to get to this because you were right. So last week on the show, you said this.
All of a sudden, everybody's an expert on the Straits of Hormuz on social media, of course.
Turns out it took like 24 hours and everyone is an expert on the Strait of Hormuz. It's funny, this whole everybody becomes an expert, right? I literally started my Monday show by saying, I'm not an expert on what's happening in Iran, and I'm not going to pretend I am. You're not coming to me for that. Other people are covering that, whatever it is. But after you were telling me everybody's going to become an expert in the Strait of Hormuz, I did look into it a little bit because I have no idea, right?
Yeah.
But what I learned and what I found, if we're talking about from an economic perspective and what damage they could or could not do to the United States, my understanding is closing that entirely is actually more of a hindrance to their allies than it is to their enemies. Like the amount of oil that moves through there, China's much more impacted than the United States is.
It's true, but that's because a lot of people don't understand the pricing dynamics in oil. So yes, 80%. So 40 years ago, closing the Strait of Hormuz would have been a death blow to the global economy. Okay. And it's not nearly as impactful today. And this isn't a perfect analogy, but just to put this into, oil is a market that is determined by what we refer to as the marginal buyer, right? So it isn't like when you see a 20% drop in crude prices, that's not telling you that crude demand is down by 20%. Crude demand might not even shift, and you could have a 20% drop in crude prices because maybe you've got some oversupply or some, coming from over here. So the way to understand crude is, I think going back and looking at 2007 to 2009 is a really good way to get this concept. In 2007, crude hit an all-time high. I believe it touched 150. Okay. By the time we got to the bottom of the great financial crisis in 2009, crude was down to like 35.40. Okay. So dropped from 150 down to 35. Okay. That drop was primarily almost completely due to a global reduction in oil demand of 3.5%.
Okay.
So 3.5% pullback in oil demand dropped the price from 150 down to 35. Now, were there a couple other dynamics in there? Yes, but the point is still true that when you don't need big shifts, if you captured 20% of the oil, and if the Straits of Hormuz closed, if they legitimately closed, you'd probably see oil go from where we're at today, 65, 70 to 140, 150 a barrel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot more significant than some of those talking heads, overnight experts would have you believe.
Yes.
Okay.
And the reason why is if you run a trucking company and you need to deliver stuff, what price are you willing to pay for diesel? Whatever price you have to.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not, it has an immediate need, meaning, if you want to turn on your lights, are you not going to turn them on because oil's at 150? No, you're going to turn your lights on. Right? So it's one of those things that you can't just say, well, we'll give oil a break for 2 months and we'll come back and see if it dropped. So so even though they don't control an amount of global supply, it could still have a massive impact on price. Furthermore, the point that I was bringing to you though, or last week, why I said I thought the threats of them actually closing it were very small, is think about that. That action offends a lot of people around the world, right? $150 oil is a problem for everybody. So that immediately, it's going to prompt a much bigger response and bigger involvement from us in the area. And more importantly, it's more likely to engender support for us and less for Iran. So it was one of those situations where like, look, clearly this is the Iranian powers that be are nuts. So you can't ever, discount it too much. But I was just sitting there looking at the whole setup going, closing the Straits of Hormuz would make their problems worse. and you heard it all weekend. Oh, they're closing the strait. Here
Yeah.
it comes. They're closing the strait. And you're like, no, they're not. Just shut up.
They're grasping. They're grasping. I would
Yeah.
feel bad for them if they weren't such horrible human beings. All right, Zach, appreciate it. Still bullish on Doge.
Yeah, man, keep it running.
Great.
And we need more of it.
Love it. Okay, we'll talk to you next week.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for having me.